Let me go ahead and today is sort of putting a jigsaw puzzle together because the real question is, how did Hampden-Sydney get through the Great Depression when it didn't have any money before the Great Depression started, and build a big fancy humanities building in the middle of it that was paid for? And to understand this, you need some background, which you've already had but have forgotten about because you would. So let me remind you. You remember that President McElwain in the 1880s and 1890s raised the level of faculty at the college by demanding that everybody who come in have at least a master's degree, and we don't much like the master's degree. What we really want is a PhD. Now, U.S. universities had only started issuing PhDs in the 1870s, so he was real near the beginning. Well, the first one was issued by Yale in 1862, but people weren't paying much attention in 1862 to degrees coming out of Yale. Anyway, very important that you get people with a good PhD to teach in your college. The thing he did that was also important and had more historic impact was we only had about 15 or 20 seniors at that point, and he flat knew what their academic record was. And he called in all the smart ones and basically, in the politest possible way, beat them over the head till they agreed to go to graduate school. At which point he would suggest strong graduate schools to them. And if they were interested in medicine or science, he pushed them hard to go to Johns Hopkins. Now, this was so effective that in the late 1890s and early on after 1900, the Hampden-Sydney Alumni Association had a chapter on the Johns Hopkins campus, okay? And there was a realtor who let somebody finish living there till he got his degree and left Hampden-Sydney and held the apartment open for the next Hampden-Sydney student who was coming in. We did this big. Now, okay, so we had a bunch of people getting good graduate degrees. That's one thing. The other thing is, you remember that Dickie Venable in the 1890s bought the seminary property and basically gave it to the college, but he also gave the college the money to move all the dirt from here down to here to get a flat football field. So the existence of that sports field is also Dickie Venable at work. And he was the most important and best-known lawyer in Baltimore. And in 1910, he died, and he had been the chairman of the Parks Commission, and so they named a new park after him. And in 1922, 23, somewhere in there, they decided to build a Baltimore Municipal Football Stadium. And they built it on the entire park that had been Venable Park. So this became Venable Field. And the first NFL football field in Baltimore was Venable Field. He was, in other words, really well known around Baltimore. Keep that in mind too. Okay. Now let's start with this map and where we left off last week, which was Bagby Science Building is up and running, and it's a really nice science building, and it was. And basically, okay. This is the wrong map because it's an imaginary map which the college commissioned in 1919 from a New York architect who came down and measured where things were and drew a map. But this is not a topographical map. And there's a giant gully that runs right there. And you can't build the thing he said he was going to build there, not unless you want a suspension bridge. But Bagby is more or less down here, okay? And it wasn't there in 1990. This building is Graham and the basketball court that went behind it, okay? But none of these are over here. The black things haven't been built yet. Only the white shaded things exist. And, well, people don't always talk to each other. And this map got prepared in 1919, and Bagby opened for business in August of 2022, which means it had to have been under construction in 2020. I mean, they had to have at least dug the hole, all right? In 2020, they really should have known what the plans were. Or alternatively, in 2019, they should have known where the college was going to put this building up, and they didn't do it. The quick version is that the only building with the right title for what actually got, and location for what actually got built, is the gym down here. That was, when it was built, 20 years later, was built by President Gammon. It was called Gammon Gym. And everything else that you see on there either was never built or, well, it was never built, basically. Something else was built instead. And it's attractive. I mean, the campus is this loop in the middle here. And you notice now that when we renovated Venable, they were careful to have a sight line all the way from the middle of Cushing to the middle of Venable through there. And this thing is the bell tower, okay? We didn't have a bell tower until we had a bell, but it was outside the president's house and somebody ran. And the bell tower was a creation of the late 1930s, and they deliberately put it in that location. And okay, as we build buildings, we'll think about this. And we paid the architect, so this is pretty good. But at the time, they were paying him the check for preparing this map. They already had the blueprints in front of them for Bagby, which they were going to put up somewhere else. Okay, but whatever. We did that. Now, the 1920s were financially a pretty good time, and more people decided they wanted to go to college. And so Hampden-Sydney's enrollment, which the faculty had been polled on before they built Bagby, how big is the college going to be in 10 years, 15 years? And they said somewhere between, the faculty collectively said somewhere between 100 and 150 students. And the architects seemed to have built for 180, being suspicious. And Hampden-Sydney was past 200 by the early 1920s. I mean, everything just expanded way too fast. Now, where were all the courses being taught that weren't science courses? The science courses, hey, they're in Bagby, which is a really nice building. Where are all the other courses being taught? There's only one academic building on campus, okay? McElwain Memorial Hall. Do you see McElwain on this map? Answer, Medi. That little rectangular dotted line there is McElwain. And the fact that before Bagby was built, and while they were only envisioning permanent buildings for the long run, the fact that they would do McElwain in a dotted line means that the architects thought Bagby should be removed, okay? There you are. But teaching everybody their humanities courses in Bagby was really hard, even after you moved out to science courses, because we're now talking about, maybe 250 in a building that had been built originally for 80 to 100 students. And it's in bad shape, and it's collapsing as we speak. And you know, this is just a really bad situation. So the president, who by that time is Dr. Eggleston, he takes over just as Bagby is under construction in 2020, and he's president until 1935. And he is a hard worker, and he's like every president before him. He has had a lot of trouble raising money. The Presbyterians who control our budget will talk about giving us money. It's just that it never happens. And every time they have a fundraising drive, they raised a third of the total that they swore they were going to get before that, which kind of doesn't help you very much. Well, okay. 1929, Black Friday, stock market craters. By 1930, it is clear that a staggering financial depression is underway. Hampden-Sydney, because it doesn't have much endowment, has had more of it than most colleges in dividend-paying stocks, because at least we can get the dividend for, at least we got that coming in. As of 1930, they weren't getting any dividends. Everybody who was, after the Black Friday and the stock market cratered, everybody stopped paying dividends. And so all of a sudden, the yield from Hampden-Sydney's endowment went, this is like really bad. But another thing happens. Remember those guys that graduated from med school and PhD graduate school from Johns Hopkins in the 1890s to 1900? By 1930, they're at the peak of their career, okay? Think about that. Because in 1930, after the Depression had started, 2 faculty members from Lafayette who were willing to do a whole lot finger licking and stroking the page went through the book Who's Who of America. Do you know about Who's Who? It's not as well known anymore as it used to be, but it used to be the index of who is doing things in the United States. It's the politicians and the sports stars and the doctors, and it used to be really, really important, and it's less so now. But in 1930, it had been the first edition of it was published in 1898, so they'd been doing this a good while in 1930. And they had the 1929-30 issue, and they went through it, and they were intending to create a journal article for an educational journal on the role small colleges, the low enrollment, small colleges who were playing in the nation's intellectual and economic life. What do little colleges provide anyway? And their index for this was what percent of all your graduates since 1900 are in Who's Who in America. That's a quick and dirty kind of judgment, but okay, it's not crazy. And they went through for everybody, including the big ones, just in case they were eating everything up, and they weren't. But all of the little ones, including Hampden-Sydney. And by the time they got through with this, the college in the United States that had the most percentage of its graduates in Who's Who in America was Hampden-Sydney. And this would mean exactly nothing except that the New York Times at that point was edited by a member of the class of 97 who had been with the New York Times since about 1905. And he was now the chief editor. And he ran a front page article with this, with several backup articles later on. And the upshot of it was, this happened in 1930. The upshot of this was that in the fall of 1930, we got way more applications than we had expected he had, And the number we expected to get was what we'd gotten the previous year, except we knew we weren't going to get that many. I mean, just forget that, but you got to plan something. So we'll plan for last year and hope for the best. What they got was 10% more applications than the previous year. They stopped when they had 318 students total, which we did not remotely have enough room for, okay? But the little suckers are all paying tuition, and we needed that bad. And it held up. 1931, we got enough to get over 300 students again. 1932, over 300. We had turned this into a permanent faucet of money. And we were, well, in 1933, because they were nervous about the dividends not coming back, which they weren't doing, they gave the faculty a 10% pay cut. This was 1933 or 34. Anyway, I just want to tell you right now that the pay cut was never given back. The big never. We have never had a pay cut to make up for the Depression. We've never had a pay raise to make up for the Depression pay cut. People have gotten raises, the salaries are okay, but that pay cut never did get fixed. But by God, we got enough students, and we're running a balanced budget, which is more than most colleges can say. And in spite of this, it's been a high-stress situation for President Eggleston. And in the summer of 1935, he tells the trustees that he wants to quit and retire because this has really just been beating him up. And they say they like him, and they say sadly that they would hate to see him go, but would he stay until they get a replacement? And he says, I can do that. So he quits, except he hasn't quit yet. Now, Dickie Venable, go back and get that fact. The student body has been inflated and better than hell's daddy by the Who's Who in America data. But the problem with having 318 students, or they almost said we can't take more than 350, and for the first time ever, we had a waiting list because more than 350 people can't go to college here. In fact, you can't, at that time with McElwain Hall being where humanities was, you couldn't even do 250. So they really had to have a ceiling someplace, and it was 350. And I have no idea where the classes were being taught, but it was a mess, and the college knew it. So President Eggleston, for 20, 30 years, has had a hobby, which is genealogy. And everybody has genealogical data in 23andMe. I mean, all these websites. Genealogy is big now. It was a microscopic activity then, because you had to do everything on paper and look up birth certificates and stuff, which is blindingly dull. And why President Eggleston had it as a hobby, nobody has any idea, but it did. And somewhere in the late 20s or early 30s, he decided to do genealogy on a on a basis that was connected to his job. So he decided he would look up all the descendants of each of the first set of trustees of Hampden-Sydney College. So he went to work on that, and you can get these records because all you have to do is go through the county records and the state records for birth certificates, the death certificates, and title deeds when you sell your property and things like that. You can do this, but you can imagine that is a slow, blindingly dull process, and nobody is going to do it, but he did it. And it turns out that one of the trustees was Captain John Morton of Charlotte County. And by the time you turn this handle long enough, Captain Morton's great, great, great grandson lived in Baltimore and was filthy rich because he was a coffee importer and he was a bachelor. And he didn't know about Hampden-Sydney College. He had been to the University of Baltimore. And he had way too much money for his own good, okay? So after he had retired from Hampden-Sydney, but before he actually got up and left the warm seat behind him, Dr. Eggleston went up to see Baltimore Morton. And basically, when he got there, it turned out as he suspected. Now he had at least written and made a call to make an appointment. So the Morton knew this was coming, but it turned out that Morton had no idea he was descended from. He didn't even know about. He knew Hampden-Sydney existed because he had buddies all over the South in the coffee trading business that had gone to Hampden-Sydney and really loved it, and this was very nice. But this was something that went by several feet away from his head. And all of a sudden, here's the president of Hampden-Sydney who explains to him about his great-great-great-grandfather being a trustee. And Baltimore Morton is really impressed. And at that point, Eggleston whips out Dickie Venable and the idea that a good thing for well-to-do people in Baltimore to do is to give money to Hampden-Sydney, because Venable did this big time. Okay, and okay, the guy says, "I'm impressed," and President Eggleston says, "Well, we have this. We really need a humanities building, and we have the drawings for one, and here they are." Okay. And he whips out the plans for Morton Hall, what was going to be called Morton Hall. And he has this with him as well. And he offers to put it right here, okay? And Morton says, "How much is this going to cost?" And he says, $75,000. And Morton says, "I can give you that. That's no problem." "Sure, build it. Put my name on it. Except it won't be my name. It'll be Morton Hall, but it'll really be great-great-great-granddad." Okay. "But let me come down and see where this is going to be." So they arrange this, and in a few weeks, while the weather's still good, he comes down, and they show him this map and take him over to where this map says that building is going to be. And if you look closely at the circle with the lines through it, that building is about as far from the bell tower, the center there where the bell tower is. That building is shown being about as far from the bell tower as what's called Main Street, but it's obviously College Road, is on the other side. In other words, that building is going to be all the way down the hill, almost out in the lake, okay, behind the dining hall, which is, of course, is not there. And in fact, if you walk into the campus along the path there from College Road, you won't be able to see Morton Hall. And Morton says, "I'm not going to pay for anything down here in a hole. I want it up there on top of the hill." And at that point, this map loses all application to anything, okay? Because this was, "Oh yeah, we're glad to do it." And so Morton got built on top of the hill. If you look, it does go downhill, and it's right about here, okay? And Could you put the next slide up? You recognize this, and it is Wharton Hall, but it's a lot simpler here than it is now because it now has the thing sticking out the front of it that is quite large, and it has changed the inside a lot. But they had already, the original idea for building a replacement for McElwain building is that we'll just duplicate all the functions of McElwain except for the science part. We already got the science part, but we'll have the debate society offices and all the humanities classrooms, and the ground floor is a fairly big for McElwain was a fairly big chapel assembly hall. And the new building will be all of those things except for the science part. And they got somebody to draw that out. It was going to be $150,000. And since at that time they couldn't raise anything that was not loose change, they said, well, maybe we could do this without we'll still have chapel in McElwain. We'll build this building without a chapel in it. But, you know, one of the things that's been really popular in Bagby is the faculty offices. We put those three were the first faculty offices any building's ever had, and they were really popular. So we're going to build this new building to handle all the humanities classes, and every humanities professor will have an office. But to get it paid for, and this is before they knew about Martin, to get it paid for, we're going to have to do without the new chapel. So what they showed Martin didn't have a chapel in it, okay, and he said, yep, I'll go with this. So they built it, and through 1936 and early 1937, they got it built. And several of the older faculty members who were, 19th century vintage, okay, thought that the new building that did not have a chapel in it was an intent to do away with Christianity, and not just a chapel service, so obviously a chapel service, but an intent to de-Christianize the college. And Professor Whiting, who was widely respected and really good, but was no spring chicken, was assigned an office in the building which he never entered. He taught for 5 or 6 years after the building was built, and he never set foot in the office they assigned him because it was evil. And there you are. But the front little projection here is really very short, okay, compared to what's there now. And if you look at the front of it, this dark green door here is really a double door, okay? So it's built so that you got to be able to lock the doors, okay? So there's a steel bar that runs down the center, which you can lock into, but the steel bar can be removed from inside the building with only 4 bolts, okay? Now, somewhere before the addition got put on, somewhere in the early 1960s, there was a student here who had a VW Beetle. And do you know what a VW Beetle looks like? Okay, everybody else does. He was very proud of it, and it was a nice little car. And one weekend, he somehow had a ride to take him home for the weekend. So he left the car here and left his ignition keys in his dorm room, locked, of course, and went home. And his friends, he had many friends, but you need many for this, okay? His friends let themselves into his room, took the ignition key, locked the door again, went over to the car, got in the car, and drove it up to the front of Morton Hall, which then had about 3 steps up to get in, okay? And then they let themselves inside, since it was standing open anyway, it wasn't locked, and they took out the steel bar in the center and opened the doors, at which point you have a garage door. And they had about 8 of them, and so they lifted and pushed the beetle into the inside of this, this section right here. And on the ground floor, that was a single open hallway, because there was a stairway that came up the side, ran across the landing here below the big window, and then went up to the second floor. And so the function of this room is only to house a stairway in it. And there's no furniture. And you can't judge sizes very well, but I'll tell you that if you push your VW in there, and it goes in because it's too small for the room. But if you then take it and twist it around at something close to a 45-degree angle, you can get the front bumper locked against the south wall and the back bumper locked against the north wall, which they did. And then they took the keys back and put them in his storeroom and put the bar back in the door. And he had to figure out how to get his car out of the busy classroom building center hallway when Monday got here. And that got favorable attention from the student body. But what this did, the process got Hampden-Sydney to about 1940 they had debt because even though Morton had paid for this building, they still owed some money on Bagby, and money was tight because it always is in a tuition-funded college, because you can't be sure exactly how many people are going to be there, and you can't charge them tuition if they aren't there. So, got to talk about what we did during World War II, but the one other thing that involves a little bit of jumping ahead here. Go to the next slide, would you? Oh, sorry. Here's the back of them. Both these pictures are about 1970, and you notice there's quite a steep hill going down to what is now the dining hall, and that original map would have had a completely invisible building here. Next slide. This is just to show you where a couple of other buildings are on campus that you know about. Well, you certainly know about John's. You might or might not know about Eggleston Library, which was where the Brown Student Center is now, in exactly the same size and appearance building. And why we tore down an expensive building, it was a library. It was a big open space. It didn't have rooms in it, okay? We tore it down and built a building just like it to be the student center. Anyway, next slide. Can you change one?
Yeah, just a second. Is that it? Has it?
No, seems nothing changed. Here we are. Okay. Next one. Okay. We got 20 minutes here. In 1957, McElwain Hall still existed, but for 10 years or so, it had been called a student activity center, which meant nothing at all because no student activities are allowed to occur in it. But they were not having chapel there anymore because John's Auditorium, which was built in 1950, was a nice auditorium, and they immediately switched chapel and assembly over there. And so after 1950, there was not a cotton picking thing went on in McElwain Hall, except that buildings and grounds used a good bit of lumber, both for construction and repairs. And they found that they had trouble keeping it dry and keeping it from bending and getting warped. And if you stored it by putting the timbers across the pews in the old chapel, it was off the ground, and so it would stay dry and it would stay flat. And so they put a big pile of pine lumber in there to stay dry and flat and usable. And that was the only thing that the building was being used for. And in the spring, about 2 weeks ahead of commencement of 1957, a bunch of students, and I have this story from a man who was a senior in 1957 and a good organizer and was a trustee for many years. And so this is almost certainly true. He didn't use any names. But they assembled pretty much everybody who lived in Cushing Hall, which by that time really had turned into a dormitory, okay? They assembled pretty much everybody who lived in Cushing, and what they wanted was to burn this down. But to burn it down, they had to be sure the Farmville Fire Department didn't come out with high pressure water and put the fire out. And that was going to be tricky. The Hampden-Sydney Fire Department didn't exist. Don't have any trouble with them. But Farmville comes out here and they'll be on this. And so next slide, can you? Here we are. Well, you recognize Cushing. What you don't recognize is that water tower down the end. That was the water supply for the north side of the campus. There was another one like it at the end of Venable. But anyway, that's not a very big water pipe, and it is supplying all of the bathrooms in Cushing, but it's also going other places on campus. I mean, it's supplying Graham and that kind of thing. So what they have to do is to empty the water tower out. So they organize this by getting a large number of people who live in Cushing to agree to go in the bathroom, one per toilet, and perpetually flush the toilet. You flush it, stand there until it fills up, flush it again. Okay? And there are now, I think, 24 toilets all being flushed forever in Cushing, and the water level in that water tank is going down big time. But beyond that, the fire department, when it gets here, will certainly lay hoses out on the ground near McElwain, which is close to Cushing anyway, and run across the front of the building to get to the pipe and connect to the, there aren't any hydrants around, but connect to what amounts to a hydrant at the bottom of the drain pipe for the tank. Okay. How can we handle that? Well, they went and got the football team, which contained the heaviest students on campus, and got about 30 of them to agree that when the canvas hose was spread out flat before, after it was connected, but before water could come through it, all of them would step on the flat hose and stand there we'll say forever, okay, the rest of the evening. And if you would show the next slide. Here it's their hose cart, and notice how flat the hose is, because zero water between the toilet flushing, which ate up, probably 24 people, and standing on the hose, which ate up another 30 or so people. This was a major student production. Furthermore, they had, and I don't know if they knew about this or were just lucky, but it turns out that, well, you've seen photographs of places that have been bombed and it's burned out, and the building is still there, but the windows are gone, but there's still rectangular holes in the brick building, and that kind of, if a fire burns out a building and it's not very hot, that's what you get, because the brick won't burn. But if you get above about 900 degrees Celsius, a really hot fire, the mortar that's holding the bricks together will chemically decompose into lime, calcium oxide, and sand. And those don't provide any grip at all on brick. And so the whole thing will decompose. So if you see a building that has officially burned down and it's rubble instead of a standing skeleton, you know the fire was above 900 degrees Celsius. And there was a lot of pine wood in the bottom of this, and they got it to 900 Celsius because the next morning, the building was not skeleton walls, it was rubble. Still smoking, but it was rubble. And several things happened as a result of this. One of them is that the fire department sent a very snotty letter to the college, the formal department, saying they wouldn't answer any more calls from Hampden-Sydney. At which point we organized the Hampden-Sydney Fire Department. But anyway, but the other thing that happened was that although we were not using the building, the trustees were really, really miffed about students burning college property down. And it's only 2 weeks till commencement, and we got this unsightly mess lying out in the middle of the campus. And the business manager at that time had been business manager for 35 years, and he knew everybody and knew how to get things done. And they had a board meeting a couple days later, and the board came in with steam coming out of their ears. They wanted to find out who had done this and sue his parents and get the money back and blah, 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 blah. And they went on for a while, and the business manager, Mr. P.T. Atkinson, let them vent for about 10 minutes and said, well, you should realize that we've been carrying $50,000 worth of property insurance, fire insurance on that building. And I've got a bid from somebody with a bulldozer in Farmville to take all the rubble away and flatten it and plant grass seed for $10,000. So the college is going to make $40,000 in this fire. At which point the board said, oh, well, okay, no problem. And that was the end of any attempt at reprimanding people. But it was handsomely organized and carried out flawlessly. There was a guy who had the little store down at the 15 filling stations, then sold sandwiches in packages, in triangular plastic packages. And there was a guy who had a pretty good business going down there about 8 o'clock at night and buying, and he knew how many to get, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 sandwiches, and carrying it back to Hampden-Sydney and walking through the dorms saying sandwiches, and he could sell all of them. And stop that. He made a bunch of extra money. Okay, this was very nice. And he had to make multiple trips. There were so many people watching the fire who wanted a sandwich that he did a great business that night, and which is one of the things that made the fire department mad too, because it was clear that this had been organized. Anyway, we did burn the library down too, but you'll have to hear about that after Thanksgiving. So anyway, thanks for coming. Have a great Thanksgiving, and I'll hope to see you next week. Cheers.